Welcome back, everybody. This is Philosophy from the Front Line. I am Rob, the Angry Colonel. If you know my podcast handle, I have JB and Dale here. We are both going to be talking about D-Day. And why does it matter to you as an individual? Maybe you care, maybe you don't care. But one of the most important things is two things. One, we're already coming out of Memorial Day, and again, everybody knows my stance on Memorial Day. If you thank me for my service on Memorial Day, I'm probably going to give you a little bit of the side eye because I made it home, and Memorial Day is truly to honor those that we lost that fell in combat serving their nation, and not to diminish anything that anyone else has done in their service. Because as a veteran, you should be proud of that status and talk about it very often. But in the grand scheme of things, Memorial Day is for those that we have lost. Veterans Day is for those all people that have served, regardless of their position. But we're going to talk about a very particular group of veterans that 78 years ago conducted the largest air, water, and ground operation in the history of the world, and I don't think we will ever see another operation of that gravity again anytime soon. And so we're going to talk about D-Day. One of the first things I always think about in D-Day is watching Band of Brothers. So I can remember as a young captain watching Band of Brothers and kind of seeing the backstory of the 506th and the Currahee Brigade and battalion as they went operationally into the war for the first time. Great personalities there. Lots of different lessons on leadership that you could see throughout the course of Band of Brothers. And then, of course, the more dramatic version of the beach landing was in the first 7 to 12 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. So if you've never watched those two films or those two opportunities, I would encourage you to check them out because you'll get some more insight. But we started talking about this a little bit earlier, and the
bridge too far.
Yeah. The fallout from World War II and the impacts on our society are pretty significant. And, they call them the greatest generation. And the reason why that is because they literally built this country, whether it be through defending it philosophically or when they got back home to do what they did when they got back, which is pretty tremendous. But I'll open the floor to JB and Dale. And so you said a bridge too far. So please talk about that, as one of the greater portrayals of, the invasion in Normandy.
Well, the interesting thing is, when we talk about D-Day, everybody pictures, the boats hitting the beaches in Normandy. They picture Point du Hoc. Even in the military, we always talk about, in the Ranger community, you're overwhelmingly talked to about the Rangers' ascent on Point du Hoc. Saving Private Ryan was, a small group of Rangers that landed at Point du Hoc, took it down, and then went and saved Private Ryan. Everything's Band of Brothers was the 101st, but it's all about the beach landing, and a lot of people forget that it was the largest, to this day, still the largest multinational airborne operation ever conducted. And they didn't land on the beach. They landed in the countryside. They landed on people's homes. They landed on tractors. They landed on churches. To this very day in France, there is John, you can probably remember the church. I forget the name of the church, Saint something. But there is, to this day, a depiction of a paratrooper with his parachute hung on the steeple of a church in France. So D-Day as an event was a three-pronged attack by air, land, and sea, and there was just so much going on. And we take for granted nowadays the ability to communicate. Prime example, we're sitting here talking to each other over Wi-Fi and with video cameras and stuff, and we have instantaneous information. Imagine the coordinations that had to take place just using very rudimentary FM radios.
Click, 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 click.
Yeah. And Morse code to communicate across an entire sector of Europe, coordinating a multinational attack into Europe to liberate Europe from the Nazi regime. The sheer, those of us that have worked in a tactical operations center or a joint operations center with modern technology have numerous irritations just with communication, and I can't even comprehend the communication difficulties they would have had during D-Day. John?
Well, that goes back. I'm going to back. I'll cue in here, but we're going to go forward. Thinking about the communication challenges during the event, we go back to mission-based orders versus task-based orders. Whereas young men and women were essentially given marching orders to move to a point on the ground and solve problems for the nation. Much larger thing than self. Backing it up and thinking about D-Day and what it means in JV's eyes. I was getting a haircut yesterday. One of the great things about being out of the Army is you don't have to get your high and tight once a week. I'm down to about once every 6 weeks, whether I need it or not. But I was explaining to the barbers and the old people there, or people older than me that were there, that hey guys, tomorrow's D-Day, and it's like, oh yeah, Saving Private Ryan, and that was about their only bit of understanding of the event and its significance. These are great. These are grown men. I mean, folks our age in our 40s and older. But it kept going on. It kind of got me on a soapbox, if you would. You got to think hard. You have to really think hard about 1944 and this significance of everything that happened leading up to it. In 1941, we were largely a nation at peace, and the military-industrial complex had not stood up in any way, shape, or significant form. In a little over 2 years, we went from being a nation at peace to generating war stocks to support operations, strategic operations around the world. The logistics involved just to make that happen. Being able to take Detroit from a bunch of farmers' fields to the building empire that it became. Something one of the things everyone continues to forget about, that June 6, D-Day started the major land invasion of Europe, but simultaneously there were large operations going on in the Pacific theater in the Philippines and elsewhere to drive the Japanese back to their homeland. So it's, when you think about it, it's not only the tactical sacrifice, but it's a celebration of America's industrialization and how quickly it changed from largely agrarian and developing community to a blustering mechanized, machinized society. Where'd my notes go? So, going back to one of the fun things I like to remind my Marine friends, there were the largest amphibious assault that ever happened in the world was at Normandy on June the 6th, and there were no Marines there.
It was done by the Army.
Kind of a thumb in the chest. So D-Day will always be important to me. I had a great uncle in the 82nd, and that's all that I was ever told growing up. So Uncle Frank was a paratrooper in 2505. No idea his background, no idea any of the history or lineage or his contribution to the war. So I grew up watching this. I too grew up watching Bridge Too Far as kind of a light post or a lamp post saying that, hey, this was Uncle Frank's contribution to the war. Digging things back, fast forward to I think it was 2000. I was on a staff ride in in Europe, and Belgium has an incredible World War II museum. If you ever get to Arnhem, definitely worth the trip. But we found out that Uncle Frank jumped in. He did the jump into North Africa. He also did the jump into Sicily with the Panthers. He made the jump on the evening of June the 5th into Normandy and was killed fighting at La Fère Causeway. So we talk again. We go back to the scenes of the beaches from Saving Private Ryan, but the paratroopers or the multinational paratroopers that jumped in, held a lot of stuff back that would have turned those killing fields from deadly to even larger graveyard. And the importance of La Fère, that was the major causeway that would have allowed the Germans to reinforce the beaches at Normandy, and our paratroopers got there first, luckily, and were able to hold those reinforcements back. Uncle Frank was buried there at La Fère. His body was in the ground from 1944 to 1957 when the body was exhumed and brought back to the States. D-Day will always have an important spot in my heart, just because of the familial connection, and it's one of those things. It's horribly sad to see, something that was such an important contribution to America's history. I wouldn't say it was a decisive point in the war, but it definitely was a turning point in the war, and how quickly we've forgotten in 78 years. Those 5 or 6,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen that made the final sacrifice there at Normandy. That I hope we're not forgetting. I hope we're taking the time to teach our kids, to teach the next generation, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes going forward.
Yeah. And not just D-Day, but the entire war. D-Day may not have been a turning point, the definitive turning point in the overall war, but the war itself was a turning point in America, and it culturally, economically, socially changed America in a way that put us on the path that has led us to where we are now. I think one of the sad things as to where we are now is because our nation has not been directly affected by something like World War II. There's people that argue that, the war on terror was the same, but it's not. One in three families during World War II were directly impacted by what was going on in the war. Every family had someone doing something to either fight in the war, build planes, build jeeps, build ships. This entire nation came together at every single level of some sort of sacrifice for the overall success of World War II. And we've never had anything since then. And where I'm going with that is we are now, three going on 4 generations removed from that sacrifice. And because of that, we are now seeing the advent of, people are taking so many things for granted, and they don't see, because they don't know the sacrifice that went into creating everything that they enjoy today. They don't they don't respect what they have today, and they don't fear losing it and we've reached that arc. We've reached that arc, and in the Army we would call it a training arc. And leading up to combat, you're highly trained and you're proficient, and then you get into combat and you become more proficient and experienced. But then on the back end of the combat, people start retiring and getting out of the military, and then your proficiency and your professionalism and your expertise goes into a dip. Well, in society, the saying goes, hard times create, or hard men, or hard times create hard men, hard people. Hard people create soft times create soft people. Soft people create hard times. We are in that band of excellence where we are now creating hard times. And I think that is because that period of post World War II, Korea, and created hard people. Those hard people created soft times, and now the soft times have created soft people. And we have a nation that hasn't found something to unify around, and like World War II really unified the nation, and on every front. We didn't worry about frivolous things. We all came together for what was considered to be the big threat. And like John was saying, we went from an agrarian culture and an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and things changed after that.
Yeah, I want to jump in real quick. And one of the things that we fail to acknowledge is the existential threat of it all, right? So when you look at World War I and World War II, everybody's like, hey, look, if we lose this, the world's going to come to an end, right? Everybody knew that the Nazis were a threat. Everyone knew that in World War I, the Germans were a threat as well. And so when you look at that holistically, the world said, okay, these guys are bad actors. We need to put them in a box. And we understood that. Whereas today, the division is not coming from external, it's coming from internal, right? So we have political leaders, we have political parties, activists, regardless of whatever side you're on. We all have people that are acting in their own self-interest, and their self-interest further divides you from your neighbor. And having that unifying moment in time is really what should be pushing us over the top. And like some of the things that we don't consider because we're older guys, like there's an entire generation that grew up under 20 years of the global war on terrorism, right? And so, like, when you look at those guys, we look at those kids and like, they suck because they're young and they don't know anything. That's part of it, but the other part of it is they experienced the war from a different perspective. Like, we were packing our bags and we were going, so there's a small portion of those, Gen Zs or Gen Xers that like don't have their parents. They lost a mom or dad because of because of GWAT. And so to them, the experience is very, very real. But the average person in America just doesn't have that impact. We went from a country where just about everyone served, as you mentioned before, Dale, to a portion we have about 8 million veterans in the country, period. And that's across all wars over all time. About 8 million. There's 300 million people in this country. So, I mean, you're looking at, just slightly over 1% of the country is veterans. And so by understanding that, it makes it very, very difficult to translate like, hey, look, this is why it's important. Yeah, it's important to us. We care about military history. We care about D-Day. We care about Vietnam. We care about other veterans. And the reason why we do is because we've experienced some portion of the hardship, and it goes back to, not all soldiers' service is equal. And we know that. However, if you strapped up, your boots at the 82nd and you jumped out of planes on Sicily drop zone, like, hey, you embraced some of the suck. But by doing that, we have a different perspective on our nation. Whereas we are loyal to the Constitution and to each other. Hey, there's a short list of folks that if I picked up the phone and said, hey, look, it's go time, we're meeting here, I'll be there in a couple of days, because that's the way that we were brought up. We moved to the sounds of the guns. That was one of the biggest things that came out, particularly for the airborne community, was LGOPs, right? Little groups of paratroopers running around doing their thing. And so that was very, very important to the success. But now, our country has evolved away from LGOPs into little groups of activists, right? So, hey, what am I going to be concerned with, right? Like, it's the truth, right? Like, where's my concern?
Yes.
Like, hey, I have to look in my own best interest. Like, if you really want to be honest and you look at some of the things that are going on in this country, whether you agree or disagree with the political left and right, I would argue that if you vote for someone based off of the color of your skin or the region of the country that you live in, you're a fool. Look at the facts. The problem is, we have gone away from even something that was, Ronald Reagan said it 40 years ago, and we don't even think about it. Trust but verify, right? Do you trust anything that's coming out of the mainstream media? No. It's called television programming for a reason. And so we have to evolve our thinking. But too many people, again, going back to your previous point about enjoying the comfort, well, why would I do research? Because doing research, that takes a little bit of time. That's hard. I can't do it as well. Let me just go to TikTok and get my news there, right? Which is easier. Yeah, which is easier to do because I don't have to put any effort into it. And that comes from being so privileged in this country to have the openness that we do. Because guess what? What you're seeing on Facebook and all your social media platforms here in the U.S., you're not seeing that in China. The Chinese are not putting out the same stuff as they're allowing on TikTok here in the United States. And so it's one of those things that you just got to be smart about what's going on in the world. China is existential. China is a threat. Whether it be financially or physically, they are a threat that's on the horizon.
Ironically, a threat we created.
And that's
not a whole nother discussion, but I just summed it up in that little statement. A threat we created.
And it's not something that it just happened overnight. I remember in the early 90s sitting in an international studies class, and we're talking about the rise of China. We spent a lot of time talking about, hey, they have a growing navy. It's like, okay, yeah, it's a bunch of, back then we're looking at it as it's a bunch of fishing boats that they mounted a gun to. But you can see how it's evolved over time. I mean, numbers wise, yeah, it's a big fleet, but capabilities wise, they've got some neat stuff, but I don't think I'm not sure that it all works. So we're talking about, just appreciation for the magnitude of the sacrifices made by in the greatest generation, and what one of the battles that I had completely forgotten about until recently, the Battle of Hurricane Forest. And I'm reading from I'm going to admit to it, but don't you ever hold me to it. From the Wikipedia, looking at the
not an authorized source or citable in any type of official.
Yeah, I know it's not. We're not in academia. There's good luck there, good news there. But the Battle of Hurricane Forest started in September of 44, ended in December of 44. But that battle alone cost the U.S. First Army 33,000 killed and wounded, including both combat and non-combat losses. The upper estimates for the U.S. forces alone were over 55,000. German casualties were about 28,000. So you're talking in the span of 3 months, losing 55,000 people. I mean, that's the equivalent of everything that was lost in the equivalent of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that were lost in Vietnam over the 20 plus years from 1957 to 1975. I think that generation could appreciate the holiday and still not holiday, but remembers a whole lot better because they had to suffer a much greater loss. You think about our recent war. You think about our recent experience in the war on terror, and combining both Iraq and Afghanistan. We're still only in the 6,000 to 7,000 range of service members lost. So I think the generation before us can appreciates the significance and the remembrance of these times, because it hurt a lot more.
Yeah,
Largely, you look at the GWAT and the sacrifices that were made. It was us going back over and over and over and over and over again. It was this. It was the same people that went to Iraq and it's like, okay, I'm home for a year. All right, you're going to go up to you're going to go over the 82nd, and oh, by the way, they're going to Afghanistan. Okay, I'm back home. I'm on orders to JSJ7. I was like, hey, Corps needs you. They're going back to Iraq. Can you jump on the plane with them? So we talk about the losses that were uh, that we've had in our generation, and largely it's the same. It was the same people going back over and over and over again. I remember. It was in my infantry battalion at Fort Stewart. We had guys that had been in the battalion. Essentially, they took a break to go be a drill sergeant, took a break to go to Korea for a year, but they were the same guys that went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, that did the invasion in Iraq, that went back for OIF 3, that went back for OIF 5. So it's largely the same folks that have been making the sacrifice. Not to take anything away from the folks that didn't do multiple tours, but there are a lot of the same folks that were a part of the show over and over and over again.
Well,
Dale, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, and to your point on that, it reminds me of a story with OIF 1 when we were staging for what was to be the largest airborne campaign since World War II, thanks to Geraldo Rivera messing that one up. But
we've got wartime stories about him.
The interesting point of that was, at the time, I was a master sergeant, and our operations officer, and I forget the man's name now, Major. Anyway, he and
I remember. He was the 4th brigade when I was up there.
Yeah, he and I were cracking jokes one day because I was a master sergeant and I was no, I'm sorry, I was a sergeant first class, and he and I was his current operations NCOIC, and he and I were sitting in current ops, and we just kind of chuckled at some of the people and everything. And it was funny that we were chuckling because we were chuckling about the same thing without even talking. And the battalion XO looked at me and he said, "What's so funny, Sergeant Roberts?" And I said, "Sir, I just think it's interesting that why can't I remember the guy's name? Anyway, Major
it's really Italian name.
Major so and so." I said, "Sir, the what's funny about all this is our mission, now that the airborne operation has been terminated, our mission to go into Asamawa and Diwania and secure the cement factory and establish operations was the exact same mission we had in 1991 in 1st Battalion of the 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment." And he just looked at me and he goes, "And how do you know that?" And I said, "Well, me and Major Knucklehead, we were there." Because he was a second lieutenant at the time. We were in 1st of the 325 in 1990 and 91 for Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And then for OIF 1, we were back in 1st of the 325th, getting ready to be part of the initial invasion into Iraq. And our battalion had the very same mission 20 some odd years later that we had in 1991. And I said, "I just think it's funny. I know this mission inside and out." And he goes, "How do you know it's inside and out?" And I said, "I was in the 1st Battalion Reconnaissance Platoon. We were the ones gathering the intel for this mission back in 91. That cement factory hasn't moved. I can tell you exactly where it is. I've been there already." And he's like, "You're kidding." I said, "No." Stood right where we're going. And that's to your point. We had so many, we had guys that fought in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and that, there were guys that fought in Panama, fought in Honduras, fought in Panama, fought in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, fought in Kosovo, now fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was our generation. And it's like, so when people sit there and talk about all this, it's like, here's one of the things I'll say was, and maybe you and Rob's observations were different because you were part of the officer corps and I was enlisted. But historically, wartime soldiers were promoted, bam, 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 bam. But for some reason, my generation of wartime soldiers, even though I got promoted pretty quickly, when OIF came up, my generation stagnated in promotions, and the two generations that were behind us were promoted past us. And I was just like, how did that happen? How did guys that have I'll never forget it. I went to a brigade formal, and my wife, who had only been married to me for a couple of years, we were in the receiving line, and, I introduced her to the brigade sergeant major and the brigade commander, neither of which had any kind of combat experience. And my wife, in her innocence, looked at me and looked at the sergeant major and then looked back at me, and she goes, I don't understand something. And I said, what? And she goes, you've got more stuff than he does, but he outranks you. And there was a weird dynamic that took place where for the enlisted side, the guys that were that had all the experience, for some reason got overshadowed by the guys that actually were the honor grad at the NCOE Academy, or was Sergeant Audie Murphy or something like that. And it's like, wait a minute, what did we just do here?
Well,
we've got chuckleheads that have never been to combat getting promoted over guys that have been walking around with combat infantryman badges with stars on them. What just happened? And the only thing, anyway, go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to jump in real quick and say the only thing that I will say to that is there's something about the Army that we forget, that we're supposed to have warriors in the outfit, whether that be on the officer or the enlisted side, right? Because I can tell you, there's a lot of colonels and generals that have one or two overseas stripes, and I find that that's embarrassing, to be honest. As a guy who did 23 years, most of which was as a grunt, and had 5 operational deployments, when I see a colonel that has 1 or 2 overseas stripes, it's like, okay, so you were holding it down at home while I was, running down the streets of Mosul, or, on the hillsides in Afghanistan doing my thing. And I don't want to take anything away from them, because all those people are very, very talented people. But for some reason, the Army tends to push out the warriors and keep the administrators. And if you look at our current leadership in the Department of Defense, that speaks to it all. And I will pause.
Do you really want me to go down that route? Because there's 2 of us in this conversation that served with the SecDef and can tell you that he was the worst choice ever.
And I will leave it at that. And that's without without kicking over too many rocks and stirring this thing up all crazy, right?
But anyway, going back to D-Day, which is the focus, and I apologize for going down a different rabbit hole on that, Rob. D-Day for me, and because is Memorial Day and D-Day for me is, everybody talks about, what are you doing for Memorial Day? You having a picnic, or you having a barbecue, or you're having people over? And I'm like, no, I don't celebrate Memorial Day and D-Day the way the rest of you celebrate it. I spend that time very quietly remembering my friends that I lost. And I was like, Veterans Day? Yeah, we'll probably kick up our heels. But Memorial Day, I was like, it's not Independence Day. It's not a celebration. It's a remembrance. And I was like, and I said, even my daughter was like, Dad, everybody's having barbecues and stuff. Why don't we do anything? I said, because today's not the day to do that. Today's the day to remember the people that lost everything, and their families that lost them so we could be safe. Today's the day to remind ourselves that we have, I hate looking at movies for inspirations, but I will have to say the end of Saving Private Ryan, where, he's standing there, the old man standing there, and asks his family, is he a good man? Did he earn the sacrifice that was made so he could be alive?
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, Memorial Day and D-Day is a time for me to try to sit back and have a coming to Jesus with myself and say, am I honoring the sacrifice that was made so I could be here today? And that's kind of, I don't know how well my daughter took it to heart, but I tried to impart that on her. Anyway,
yeah. So I got three things, and then we'll wrap. So the first two things that I'll mention are movies that are kind of in line with what you just said. So like there's tons of stuff on D-Day. I would encourage you to watch them all if you get the chance. What I tend to do is I usually start the week prior and start watching Band of Brothers so I can finish, World War II on D-Day of watching Band of Brothers. There's tons of historical documents and historical movies that you can watch, but I like Dick Winters quite a bit. He actually has a new show on Amazon, a documentary called Hang Tough, which was his phrase that he would tell all of his guys when they were in a really bad situation. So I'd encourage you to check that out. The other part of it is there's two really good movies that you can check out that are about Memorial Day if you haven't watched them. Taking Chance. I mean, as much as I like Kevin Bacon, that's a great movie to watch because it truly shows the honor and the reflection of how you should be reverent on Memorial Day and of those that we had lost during combat. And then there's a movie called The Last Full Measure. So if you guys like Sebastian Stan from other stuff, then that's a great movie to watch because he actually fights to get a Congressional Medal of Honor for the first enlisted airman in 2000 or his 2019 film, but it was a really, really good movie. I would encourage you to watch it. And then to wrap the show up, I am going to read the letter that a lot of people have posted today who are historical buffs, but this is actually from the Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower on the day before D-Day. So he wrote a letter that states, "Soldiers, sailors, airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and our brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But in this year, 1944, much has happened since the Nazis' triumph in 1940 and 1941. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battles, man-to-man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons, munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together in victory. I have the full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking." Signed, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. It's very, very difficult to forget about stuff like that, particularly when it comes at a time like it is today. But gents, I appreciate you guys being on to talk about D-Day and some of your experience in the uniform. This is Rob Robinson from Philosophy from the Frontline, and we will see you guys on the high ground. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Philosophy from the Frontline with Rob Robinson. We will bring you more interesting veteran transition stories, veteran advocacy, and more information in veterans transition in general on a podcast platform near you. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks.